Hello! Welcome to Matrix Live Season 3, Episode 22.
Yeah.
We've not had one of these for a little while. The last few weeks we've been without, so we thought we'd go a bit old school. Really just tell you what we've been up to recently, what we're doing right now, and what to expect over the next few weeks. We're just going to go through our big news stories, I suppose, and tell you all about it.
Sounds good to me. You're not Amandine.
It's true. I'm afraid you have to put up with me today, but
I just told Amandine that we were going to do an old school Matrix Live, and she looked a bit sad. And so I miss it.
oh dear, she could join us.
Well, she's got to do other stuff, unfortunately. But so we should get Amandine back like next week or something and go properly back to roots. But yeah, that's a good idea. Let's talk about all the things which have been going on this week.
So, well, not even this week. We should probably talk about the big elephant in the room.
Yeah.
We should.
Yeah, this is true.
It's-
Although it has been quite dominating this week and the last couple of weeks. So the elephant, I guess, is the security incident back from April the 11th. Folks have hopefully seen the post-mortem and remediation posts which we put out a couple of days ago now to try to give the full context of the security breach. And in the unlikely event that anybody watching this doesn't know the wider context, I guess we should quickly recap it and then we can dip into a bit of it, I guess.
Yeah, I think so.
So what happened is that on April the 10th, Neil was on holiday.
Yeah.
I was on holiday. Amandine was on holiday. I think the moral of the story is that if the three most senior people in a team go on holiday at the same time, you're basically guaranteed an apocalypse of the highest order. On April the 9th, we got this tweet from Jakey Zarif, a security researcher, who said to us, "Hey, can you DM me?" And we said, "Oh, DMs are open." And sure enough, he DM'd us to mention that we had our public-facing Jenkins was out of date and indeed vulnerable to a remote code execution vulnerability. You might be wondering, why the hell does Matrix or did Matrix.org run a public-facing Jenkins? And the answer is transparency, really. That we obviously spend our lives relying on continuous integration to check whether our code and PRs are safe and passing on the unit tests and integration tests. And it felt really wrong that that would be limited to the core team working on Matrix. Lots and lots of people contributing to public Matrix.org projects from the wider world. They should be able to see the same tools that we can see. So we stupidly exposed it to the net. Even more stupidly, we didn't keep it security patched aggressively to the nearest day. And in fact, it was running several months old version of Jenkins at the point that we saw or realized that it was. We went and upgraded it and then realized, was poking around to see if this RCE had been compromised, that it had indeed been compromised. In fact, worse than we could possibly have feared, in that there were root SSH keys all over the place on about 2/3 of the servers which run all of the Matrix.org infrastructure. Now, I guess it's a good point to spell out that the whole security incident only impacted the infrastructure that runs the Matrix.org home server and some of the associated services. And it wasn't an attack on Matrix. It wasn't an attack on the protocol. That's not saying that the protocol is bug-free. God knows there are still some issues on it, which we're trying to shake out for Matrix 1.0. But in this instance, it was a classic pure infrastructure bug. In fact, there's no evidence that the attacker even knew what Matrix was until they started roaming around the network and actually looked a bit at what the project was doing. And instead it was scanning for what we assumed that it was somebody scanning for Jenkins vulnerabilities and just found us as a public Jenkins instance. Shall I just keep monologuing like this for a bit? Or how do you want to do it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it'd be useful. So we had this problem. We realised shush keys all over the place. How do we think they did it? Because you start with your compromised Jenkins. That's one box.
Mm-hmm.
What do they do?
So the RCE basically allows you to run arbitrary code on Jenkins. The actual exploit allows you to go and suck down some Java from an arbitrary URL, which abuses a vulnerable plugin or plugins on Jenkins to run the code. I think, honestly, I haven't dug that deeply into how the exploit itself works. I think it's a metaprogramming thing that there is code which can be executed during the class loading phase of the plugin or something like that, which allows you to break out of the basically run arbitrary code on the thing. From there, they got through to a Jenkins slave called Flywheel, which is a Mac Pro, which is still sitting in the corner of the office here, which ran a lot of the continuous integration pipelines for Riot Android and Riot iOS. And it was there that they set some code running, which would sit there waiting for somebody to shell into the machine. And if it had a SSH agent configured to forward keys, then it would hijack the person's SSH keys who had logged into that machine and would then go and log in on their behalf to as many different machines it knew about. The list of machines was like 18, probably gathered from looking at the .ssh known hosts file on the box, or it could have been from any of the other data on the Jenkins build slave there, or indeed the Jenkins build server, which obviously had a lot of information checked out on it. And yeah, they went and put a malicious SSH key as root at on all of those boxes in production. And unfortunately, those boxes were exposed via SSH to the general internet, meaning that you could then just SSH straight in as the attacker and start doing bad stuff. And this had happened on April the 4th. And so by the time we realized what was happening on April the 10th, they'd been in the systems for about a week. And going through forensics, had been shelling in multiple times, probably about 8, 9, 10 times in total on average per machine, to go and poke around and see how the network was set up and exfiltrate valuable looking data, doing things like dumping our Passport database, Passport being a password manager that we use, a really nice open source password manager written by a Luxembourg outfit. Dumping its MySQL database and exfiltrating it. Now, the good thing about Passport is that it's end-to-end encrypted using GPG, so they didn't actually get that much valuable data off it. But they basically spent a week, or at least 2 or 3 fairly solid days, poking around the infrastructure until we cottoned on. So we spent April the 10th, which was I think a Wednesday, going and trying to get a handle on the situation and to do forensics to see what they were doing, what they had been doing, what they had access to, and what the correct remediation or the correct immediate response should be. And at the end of Wednesday, we concluded that if we locked them out of SSH and we locked down traffic as much as possible, we could at least get some sleep before then starting a massive rebuild of everything. Because if somebody has got root everywhere, you have to assume that everything is compromised, both in terms of the risk of being tampered with, the risk of there being backdoors left around the place. For instance, one of the backdoors that had been left around the place was a setuid root shell, which is a funny story behind it. When I spotted this setuid shell had been left around hidden, looking like it was part of a sendmail or something, we thought, interesting, we found a really malicious thing that's sitting here, setuid root. It was called chroot, and thought, okay, we're going to have to analyze what this is. And so I spun up Ghidra, which is the NSA reverse engineering thing, which is suspiciously similar to IDA, the interactive disassembly tool, and went and disassembled this thing and poked around in it and was thinking, it's got a shell in it. My God, it's got to be like a full rootkit, exotic malware thing with all sorts of bad stuff in it. And it was only after about 20 minutes of reverse engineering this thing and going through its subroutines and thinking, well, it really looks like a shell. It's like got arithmetic in it and environment variables, and it knows about commands like printtemp and this sort of thing, that I finally thought of doing an MD5 on it and looking for the MD5 hash of this thing, only to discover that it was the standard Debian distribution of Dash. So it was literally just a shell, nothing more and nothing less, with being put with a set UID root. Either way, I digress. But basically, there were backdoors left around the place, and you just got to burn it all to the ground. I think Amber used the phrase "salt the earth."
Salt the earth, and we did. And actually, just a sort of, well, this was was a very serious period for us. But while we were trying to just piece back all the steps and figure out the breadth of the attack, and we were trying to figure out who entered where, and we started to get a sense of how the attacker had entered and all this kind of thing, and then try to sort of map that back to how had they got access. And of course, because they were hijacking someone else's SSH session, I mean, it looped back to us. It was us who had done this thing. So yeah, it was a sort of brief moment. It was like, Dave, have you really been there?
But what were you doing with Jenkins that day?
Yeah. But no, it was someone completely different.
So basically, we burnt everything to the ground over the course of the Thursday, April the 11th. Had some comedy disasters with the rebuild, predictably enough, because the data center provider we were rebuilding one on went down during the rebuild. We couldn't provision new hosts anymore. We couldn't provision hosts in new data centers. I think we both hit capacity, hit like fair usage limits. They thought they were being attacked because we were spinning up a whole bunch of big hosts very rapidly. And they were having an outage on their APIs, so that lost us 6 hours or something. That wasn't stressful at all, and it wasn't even me doing it.
And hey, you're in super paranoid mode as well, so everything that doesn't work in quite the way you expect, you start to sort of doubt yourself a little bit of what's going on at all.
Indeed, but we got it back up around midnight that night. With all the core services for matrix.org, none of the bridges, none of the integrations, but at least Synapse, Signal, Sident, the databases, load balancers, very basic monitoring and that sort of thing. And got the blog up, told everybody about it. Had to obviously reset everybody's access tokens, because the last thing we needed was, if the attacker had lifted the access tokens, for them to be logging in onto people's accounts. And so we vaped all of those. We haven't rotated people's passwords. It did become clear that hashed passwords and heavily hashed passwords have been lifted by the attacker, but we've left that up to users on matrix.org. So if you haven't updated your password yet, please do, because it's technically the attacker could go and try to brute force it. It'll be tough, to be honest, because we hashed them. First of all, it's salted, it's also peppered, it's also decrypted via 4,096 rounds, which takes about 500 mils on a typical machine to test one password. So if you are going to brute force it, that's going to take quite a long time to get the right answer. But still, if it's a common password in a dictionary, it might only be a couple of 100,000 things. So 100,000 times half a second is still sounding tractable if you fire up AWS and get a bunch of nodes to do it. So long story short, please rotate your passwords. And then we had the comedy of the attacker defacing the whole thing on the Friday morning, because whilst we had rotated the Cloudflare API key, which had been leaked, and I can remember checking twice whether we'd done this, and everybody confirmed each time, yep, we really have. Turned out that Cloudflare's UI for doing this is horribly confusing, and even if you think that you're logged in as an admin, you hit the rotate button to change this API key, and actually rotates your personal one rather than the admin user that you think you're logged in as. So that allowed the attacker to repoint our DNS GitHub defacement page for a couple of hours. We spotted it almost instantly, other than the fact that everybody who knew how to fix it had just gone to bed, and we didn't have monitoring or the escalation stuff back up yet, so there was an embarrassment of failing to wake us up to fix it. But eventually I got a phone call from Neil like 7 o'clock in the morning saying, Matthew, it's down again. And I sort of said, no, Neil, what do you mean it's down? Like the Synapse crashed? No, it's really quite down.
We have a problem.
We have a big problem. So I mean, it was easy to mitigate because we just point the DNS back. The attacker tried to set a high TTL on the DNS record, but Cloudflare luckily gives you a way of mitigating that relatively effectively, and got the thing back up. I mean, ironically, the attacker accused us of being not transparent enough with what was going on, which is amusing given that we obviously try to be as transparent as possible with Matrix. And I guess the thing they objected to was that I'd said in the blog post that we didn't believe that they were targeting Matrix user data specifically, and it was more somebody who was seeking credentials for onward compromise. You know, they were lifting our passport database, they were looking at our AWS key, but we hadn't seen any large-scale exfiltration of data. There were no big spikes of traffic going out of the databases or any of the other sort of large pools of user data that we store. It's possible that they might have lifted access tokens and started looking at people's accounts, but then we would have seen devices appearing on your accounts and notifications of devices having been added and that sort of thing. And there isn't any evidence of that having happened. So either way, they took offense at that, and so put this defacement up to spell out that they had got access to the main database, and that they had owned 18 machines or whatever it was. We repointed DNS back. Then subsequently they filed a bunch of GitHub issues against us, which folks may well have seen, spelling out how they'd done the attack. It matched what we'd seen the previous day whilst doing our forensics. In fact, there wasn't any new information there, other than highlighting that using a copy of our wiki had been particularly useful, which makes sense.
So we got to the point where we felt we'd at least fixed the perimeter, and we felt not great, but at least we're in a stable position, which gave us a few minutes to have a little think about, well, what do we want to do about this? Because it's one thing to have this kind of thing happen to you. You've got to think very carefully about your remediation. How are you going to prevent this sort of thing ever happening again to you? Like what's trying to go through? Right. Or I mean, basically, it's a risk-based problem, so you're just trying to really limit that risk. So it might be worth just talking a bit about remediation steps.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we had to do a bunch of immediate stuff to counter this. I mean, obviously, we locked down SSH from being accessible to the public internet. We obviously rotated everybody's SSH keys, as well as every secret that had been lifted. Well, every secret we have. Full stop, basically. Luckily, we already maintain a list of all of the secrets and keep them all in one place. The bad news, though, is that place was unencrypted and it was checked out in a Git repository everywhere. So really, at the time, there was a bunch of immediate steps we took. We also disabled SSH agent forwarding because this entire attack was made so much worse by the fact that a lot of folks were by default forwarding their SSH keys via their SSH agent to every box in the matrix.org infrastructure, which basically allowed the attack in the first place beyond the original Jenkins RCE. So did sort of initial steps like that. Since then, we obviously had a lot of time spent doing the rebuild, and we've now been looking at remediation in general. I think it started like a week later. We had everybody sit down in this room and go through the retrospective of how we handled the whole incident internally and what we screwed up and what we got right. I think it was roughly a 4-to-1 ratio of bad to good. And then then started the process of how we're going to fix this properly. So rolling out two-factor auth for SSH, really obvious thing to do. And I've got a whole bunch of YubiKeys on my desk, which we're starting to deploy, as well as other 2FA approaches. Getting a VPN set up, so rather than exposing SSH to the public internet, instead there is a VPN terminator somewhere, such that at least that is the initial front door, and there is nothing else publicly accessible at all. But then from that, you would go via SSH to a jump box, and then from the jump box, in turn, you will go to SSH in whatever production environment you're looking at. Also, splitting the production environments up The CI environment, or shouldn't be production at all. It's a DevTools thing. It should have absolutely no access into production whatsoever. Even if it was doing continuous deployment, it should at least be prodding a HTTP API on production, such that production can then go and copy an artifact out of the CD process to deploy it. But even that's kind of risky in terms of if the CI got owned, like Jenkins got owned, you obviously don't want to be continuously deploying malicious crap into production. What other things do we do for that? Network architecture, SSH measures, whatever SSH measures. Actually auditing the thing. There's a lot of, I should spell out that the infrastructure that got owned was legacy stuff that we'd set up in a rush when we first started New Vector back in 2017. All of the professional grade commercial stuff like modular.im that we run as New Vector was fine. Partially we got lucky on this because some of the infrastructure, like the provisioning system, was on the legacy architecture. So if the attacker had decided to really go after modular servers, there are routes in there. But as it happened, they didn't. And part of that was because it had better network security. It didn't have root SSH available to the world. It didn't have whatever things does modular get right. Basically had the best practices that we'd screwed up. It did have SSH forwarding enabled, but the fact that you didn't have root access there and everybody was logging in under role accounts and then suing in his own right was already a step in the right direction. So basically we had hardened stuff to a certain extent on the commercial stuff. The free matrix.org server stuff was basically out of the box Debian and hadn't been hardened at all. So going through hardening that, looking at this here, SSH configs and turning off the stuff you don't need, like do you really need X11 forwarding on your SSH? Do you really want agent forwarding? All these sort of things we did a bunch of work on too, and we continue to do it. Another thing we should talk about is probably packaging. So probably for me, the most embarrassing scrub in all of this is that we had got sloppy with where we kept the signing keys for the Debian repositories for Synapse and Riot, and also the Riot Android Google Play Store signing key, which when we first got them, I think we had best practice with them, and we were keeping them at least on one device, which one person had access to. And as time went on, sort of responsibility for doing releases moved around a bit. People would get a little bit frustrated about how tedious it is to manually do releases on a build device, and instead said, well, why don't we hook this into CI? And so they were putting it into sort of not the actual CI process, but they were putting it on production servers, which you would at least before the ones which you used to distribute the packages, you would put the signing key next to the place where you were distributing it from, so it was easy to sign it before you distribute. And it's a disaster, because if that server gets owned, then the signing key can be used to sign malicious software. And some of the keys had passphrases, which is okay, but it's still not great. And so what we had to do was to rotate those. We had to rotate the PGP keys for the Debian repositories, and we had to replace the Riot Android signing key. There is no evidence that these keys have been abused at all. Either we certainly didn't push any malicious packages from us. There's technically the possibility that an attacker could use them to craft malicious packages and push them out to Android or other Debian clients. But because we've revoked all of them now, that window was pretty narrow, and we're not aware of any evidence of that having happened. Annoyingly, that meant that we had to kill the Riot Android App Store page and replace it with a new app ID with a new signing key, because that's how it works on the Google keys, at least today. Google just announced at Google I/O a few days ago that they've got a new signing mechanism coming in, but it only works on Android Q, and it's only going to work on the Google Play Store and all sorts. But basically, it caused us to have to start over on the Android app, which is a real shame.
So give us a review.
Yeah, give us some reviews, give us some downloads. I think it's up at like a couple of tens of thousands of downloads now, but previously we're up at a couple of hundreds of thousands of downloads. So it's a bit of a shame, really, that happened. So what are we doing on packaging? Well, we're doing a secure build terminal again. This time it's air gapped, so it's not going to be connected to the internet other than very briefly when you suck the code down that you want it to build. The build environment will be set up from scratch on a clean OS image such that we can vape it and rebuild it trivially, even if we think the thing might have got owned. We keep it in a secure physical location. It's a pain because we're a distributed team. Even though we've got this office here, there are lots of people hanging around the world working and contributing and wanting to release Synapse. But we basically need to make sure that at any given point somebody has physical access to this machine so we can do emergency builds. There's probably some subtleties we can do there, and we're still in the process of transitioning to that build system. But we really want to be as paranoid as possible going forwards and look after the key well. Also use hardware keys wherever possible, which we're already doing for the Windows Riot desktop apps, but we can also set it up so that we use HSMs and hardware keys for signing the rest of Riot.
What's going on with CI?
We're not using Jenkins anymore. I mean, it's not really Jenkins' fault, but architecturally they do allow arbitrary plugins to do arbitrary things, and it can be a pain to keep both the plugins and the master system upgraded. It's probably fine as an internal tool, except even then it's kind of tempting, I think, for an attacker to try to exploit in the manner that we saw happen here. And so we've moved to BuildKite, which seems to be working quite well. You've been using it for Synapse for ages, right?
Yeah. I mean, we just got to the point where we wanted to get better coverage across all the different versions of Python. We wanted to support all the different versions of Postgres, SQLite, and that started to get really pretty heavyweight, and BuildKite enabled us to scale that way. You basically end up just BuildKite provides all the orchestration, and then you just spin up a whole bunch of Spot instances on AWS, or you have your own hardware, or whatever you want, and that works really well. And just completely aside from all of this, that's just rocketed us into the future from a CI point of view, and that seems like a great way for us to go more generally. Also, because all the hosts are very sort of ephemeral anyway, it's pretty what we want in this kind of case. And so yeah, very happy with that, and I think that's pretty what we're just sort of doubled down on.
Yeah. But I did get the CEO of GitLab pinged me on Hacker News saying, "Why didn't you use GitLab CI?" To which I said, "Oh, yeah, sorry, Sid." Well, I mean, basically, we're already using BuildKite, we know how it works, and it's working well enough. Perhaps we'll end up using more GitLab CI in future. In fact, for private stuff, we probably will use it. So I should probably mention that to him. We also had the Jenkins core maintainers turning up. Do you see that? Saying, hey, they came into Hashmatrix Dev saying, guys, I'm really sorry that you got bits and bias. What can we do to help? To which I'm afraid I said, sorry, we've probably moved on now. And honestly, there's been a lot of support during this whole mess from people trying to, or wishing us good luck in fixing it. Hopefully this Matrix Live, as well as the remediation and the blog post details, give some visibility on what we're doing to make damn sure this never happens again, and that we're smart enough, hopefully, to learn from our mistakes and share them with everybody else so that they can also learn from our mistakes. If you haven't turned off SSH agent forwarding, please just do so now.
One learning from this video.
Yeah, that is the only thing that people should take away. Because the thing is, we've been doing it for 15 years or so. I can remember, so we both started working together, in 2003, 2004, something like that. And I can remember my first day at the company where a lot of the Matrix gang got together then, turning up and discovering that everything was using SSH keys. Like back in 2003 or whatever, that's already a little bit out there because a lot of people were sort of thinking of SSH like being telnet but secure. You got a password, and what's this SSH key thing that everybody's talking about? Then to start talking about agents and forwarding your keys around the place and thinking, well, this feels a bit weird. And I can remember Chris, our illustrious tech overlord at the time, saying, guys, just remember, never ever forward your key to an untrusted server. And everybody thinks, well, okay, that's fine. So if I'm logging into someone else's machine, I shouldn't forward my key. That sounds good. But what is trusted? Well, obviously my own machines are trusted. And so everybody got into this pattern. I think loads of people do, that they assume that their own infrastructure is trusted, and what's the worst that can happen if they forward an SSH key into it? Well, this, my friends. So, yeah, that's probably the biggest take home on it. Also, don't have your SSH open to the wider internet, even though it's so common for people to do so. Petition the network and keep patched. And keeping patched is going to be a challenge. I mean, we're basically doing best effort. Whenever you see a security advisory, remember to update. But now we're really going to have to be super disciplined on every week, going through, checking to see of our list of software we run, what needs to be updated, setting up unattended installs on Debian, which Modular was doing correctly every night. It was doing its own unintended upgrades, but we weren't doing it elsewhere. Need to do that everywhere. And hopefully, yeah, that gives an idea of where things are at. Apologies again to everybody who got caught in this. We're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. And everybody who is running their own home server, who is completely unaffected by it, should feel very smug. And it really points out that the decentralized nature of Matrix has some benefits. Even if one node gets destroyed, everybody else can quite happily keep going.
Yeah, I mean, it was, a sort of, we had a war room that we were using to coordinate our response to this, and being able to just continually and seamlessly stay on Matrix as a network during that time. I mean, it was exactly the right tool that we needed. It was nice just to, just because Matrix.org was not present, we were able to carry on just pretty much as we had.
It's interesting, actually. It's the first time that we did one of these and didn't fall back to one of these, like a major production incident, not a security incident, but we didn't fall back to IRC.
Right.
So historically, we've run our own IRC network, which we fall back to if Matrix has gone completely tits up, to use the technical phrase. Whereas, yeah, as Neil says, in this instance, we fell back to a whole bunch of different backup home servers that we have, and it was so nice to be dogfooding even in a complete crisis like that. What else can we say? We were meant to be talking about non-security things, but it's all got a bit out of hand, and we've ended up enthusing about security instead.
Well, let's talk about the other stuff going on.
We'll do it quickly, perhaps.
Yeah.
We don't want to steal all of Ben's juicy material for future Matrix Live.
Yeah, let's see. This is a kind of teaser for every awesome thing Ben's going to put in front of you over the coming weeks.
Next week on Matrix Live.
So, reactions.
Yeah, we should point out on the security stuff, as we're talking about security, it was about 6 people who basically worked almost 24 hours a day for about a week at least to worry about security. And we very consciously petitioned the team to be that number of people just doing nothing but rebuild and remediation work. Everybody else has been hammering away, trying to keep the business as usual going, and doing proportionally more work to try to make up for the impact. And one of the cool things which has been happening in parallel is reactions. So hopefully by this time next week we will have the first cut of emoji reactions on Riot Web and Riot iOS and Riot Android and Synapse. In fact, we already have it on Riot Web. It doesn't really have the back end, but Eric produced the PR for Synapse for a couple of days ago, and we're iterating on it. We had a comedy screw-up where the spec is still very at an early draft stage, and it's a bit naughty that we're implementing it before the spec has gone through a full MSC review, but time is of the essence on this, and we really, really want to get it out. Yes, it ended up that we implemented slightly different APIs from the front end to the back end, if you can imagine such a thing.
But we had a whole gathering together just to flush out those for just in case that sort of thing would happen.
Yeah.
And we caught it there, and it worked, so that's fixed now.
Yeah,
and we're going to have
really. I think it's going to be super exciting. Can't wait.
Yeah, I'm interested because it's not just a sort of bolt-on feature. It fundamentally changes the way that you communicate within the app. It's I quite regularly will just post an emoji in response to something someone has said, and this really is going to change sort of quite a fundamental interaction pattern. So I'm fascinated just to see how it actually plays out in the hands of users.
Other stuff going on, communities. So Nad, who is the god of Riot UX and UI work these days, has basically finished his emoji work and so has gone on to communities. And just had a sync with him just before this. And the community stuff is looking really interesting. One of the ideas that has come out of it is to try to differentiate in our revamped community world between the concept of a community that I invite people and rooms into, and that is something that people have opted into participating in. So if I create plus community on matrix.org, like the list of matrix community rooms, you might want to obviously add community rooms into that community. And what we're proposing, and it's not locked down at all, but I think it's a really interesting thought experiment, is that the entries to that community would have to be confirmed by whoever or whatever it is that you're inviting in. So if I create plus community and I add, I know, the Neko Reborn room into it, then Red Sky over at Neko needs to have accepted the invite for his room to be part of that community. So you get a much more, basically better semantics of how the community is structured. In that you know that it's a much more cohesive thing. It's not just some random fishy thing that somebody's gone and put out there on Matrix. Conversely, we do still though support that as a concept, and the idea is to call it lists, a bit like Twitter lists, where individuals or communities, confusingly, can go and curate a random list of rooms or a random list of users. But it is no way a kind of mutually agreed definition of a community. It's just me saying, hey, here's my personal list of random rooms or whatever, and it requires no invite, no opt-in, no consensus. So long story short, that changes how they work quite a lot from a UX perspective. Underneath it's still groups, and that will probably end up all being groups as rooms in the end. But basically now there's been churning out more and more and more wireframes and designs for Riot to consider how that sort of distinction could work and how it could be formalized in Matrix as a whole. It's a bit like the way that rooms can be split into DMs and not DMs. This would be splitting groups into communities and lists, possibly.
Yeah, that's always been the tension we've had, particularly the last ituration of how do you marry those two, really related but actually quite fundamentally different use cases for grouping stuff together. Cross-signing.
Cross-signing is progressing. Hubert is on a one-man mission to sort out the cross-signing and end-to-end encryption. He pushed a whole bunch of commits last Friday for the JS SDK. He's working on the Synapse side of it and basically doing all of the work that's needed on that end-to-end. 1.0, Matrix 1.0, whatever happened to that, Neil?
Yeah, when you're rebuilding all your infrastructure, the same folks that do that are also the same other folks that you want to be working on your 1.0. So that's set us back a little bit, but we're just about at the point now where we're starting to make a bit more progress. You can look at all the items that we've got outstanding. It's on our project board, which is in the root of the matrix.org, matrix-org GitHub repo, so you can go and have a look. But it's basically security-orientated items. We've got a new version of a new room version to come, V4, and we're just working through those now. So hopefully we're not too far away from being able to call Synapse 1.0, which will be huge.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The list of things there are all bitty. Like, we've done all of the chunky things. I guess there's like server key validation time is the biggest blocker.
That's probably the largest one.
But it's not a fixed state res or I don't know, fix our event ID collisions. It's more of here's a hygiene thing that we can't really ship in a broken state, and we've got to do it, and it's just a matter of focusing folks enough to get those final things across the line. Also, we need to finally release 0.5 for the CS API, which has now been blocked on me for about 6 weeks. So apologies to everybody who's been waiting for lazy loading and the other things to land in 0.5. A lot of it is, basically the only blocker is me reviewing the Kitsune's lazy loading spec work and also adding in some of the bits which went missing along the way, and it's my fault for taking ownership on that whilst also juggling a million other things, but I will get it done as quick as I can. Pantalaimon continues.
Yeah, you can. I mean, Polya demoed to us last week. You can do emoji-based verification now. just providing an API. So that means that you run your daemon on your box, you run your client talks to the daemon, and out of the box, you now have the ability to speak end-to-end via Matrix. You can verify devices via Matrix. And you know, we sort of see this kind of capability as really a blocker for making E2E by default be a thing in Matrix, because if we just switch it on, we're kind of going to lock out a whole chunk of all sorts of apps and bots and, you know, all sorts of infrastructure related to Matrix. And so if you want to just build it natively yourself, you can. But if you just want to reuse this daemon, you can do that too, and that's a great way to get you going. So that's really great stuff, and really rapid progress there as well. So I'm delighted about it.
And finally, last but not least, GSOC. So we got accepted into Google Summer of Code this year, and we just announced the 4 folk who we're taking on. Mm-hmm. And we have CNLY. I'm not sure how you best pronounce.
I'm delighted that that's the one you could remember, because that's certainly the one that I was struggling with the pronunciation of that. How I was.
So CNLY is working on Dendrite stuff. I can't remember if there was a specific bit of Dendrite is looking at.
I think CS API. Just trying to make sure that it's spec compliant.
Cool. And he'll be working with Brendan and Anoa on that. So it'll be great to actually get a bit more folks looking at poor old Dendrite, which continues to slightly languish in the shadows whilst we get Synapse 1.0 finally out the door.
Got Aisha going to look at a DAG visualization tool.
Yep, Erica's super excited to be working on that with him. Who else? Come on, we can do this.
We've got someone working on bridges.
Yep, we've got Kai Hiller from University of Karlsruhe, from memory, who is working with Half-Shot on bridges. The specific proposal there was to make bridges more stable and to have sort of reliability mechanisms built in, so you can tell if you're in a room and the bridge is cracked out that the bridge is cracked out. I have a sneaking hopeful feeling that we can do a bit more general bridge work to improve it, like EDU's presence, replies, emoji, critically. Oh yeah, reactions.
There we go.
Oh, that'd be fun. God, I wish I was doing that. And finally,
Kitsune to work on.
So Kitsune mentoring the Alexei Andreev.
That's right.
To work on libqmatrix client, which is now. I'm allowed to spoil Kitsune's news. Hopefully, it's already made it into TWIM. But Kitsune just renamed libqmatrix client as libquotient.
Oh,
isn't that cool? I think Quotient's an awesome name, mainly because I voted for it, but so did Kitsune. So they've just had a big poll for how to rename it, and there were like 8 options. libquotient won, and so the idea is for Alexei, not to be confused with Kitsune, confusingly, will be working with Kitsune, and also Hubert or Ihareg on doing end-to-end encryption in libquotient, so Quaternion and Spectral and any other clients which use libqmatrix client, now libquotient, will get end-to-end encryption. So that'd be cool. So congratulations to those guys. It was a really tough decision this year. There are a couple of ones which we really wanted to accept as well. We only got 4 slots. I think I apologised personally to those impacted by it, and I feel a bit bad, honestly, that we had to turn away some people who put a lot of effort into building Matrix clients for things like embedded HTML chat rooms specifically.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it?
Which, it was basically looking at the 4 things we could put our chips on, and we went with those in the end. But thank you for everybody who applied. Hopefully it'll be a fun summer of code. And we have gone on way too long.
We do have 2 interns joining this summer, but we'll introduce them as and when they arrive.
Yeah, use interns as Matrix Live canon fodder. I should also say this episode has been sponsored by Brewdog Nanny State non-alcoholic beer, in case you're wondering if the incident had pushed me to alcoholism or not. I'm sure Neil's also drinking non-alcoholic beer, right, Neil? Yeah, you see.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's, from here it looks, Anyway, right. I think that's it.
Yeah.
This is a really long one. Thank
It
you for
was.
sticking with us.
Yeah, and thanks for keeping the faith, everybody. In fact, one final thing on security, because we have hardly mentioned it at all this episode, is that we got our stats back up after the incident, and interestingly, traffic levels haven't dropped. They also haven't increased at the level they normally increase at, because it's constantly going woo up. Basically, the growth that we expected in April has been cancelled out by the impact of the whole security incident. So it's not literally a step back, but it's certainly been a massive, massive time waste. But in case you were wondering whether the entire thing was, collapsing after the impact of this, no, and in fact we're seeing things growing at roughly the rate they were before. It's just that there's a big flat bit in the middle. So thanks again for flying Matrix. Apologies for the turbulence and the hijack, and we'll speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.